In the first part of this series, we talked about how composer Matsuo Hayato created character themes for some of the many heroines in the first 2 seasons of The World God Only Knows. Last time we talked about the new themes he wrote for Season 3 and how he structured them in a way that allowed for a natural progression into what were the heroine's goddess themes. And so, for the final part of the Kaminomi series, we're going to take a look into how Matsuo took some of the original themes from those first 2 seasons and then evolved them into goddess themes. Remixing and rearranging music are fairly standard skills for composers and producers to have in their arsenal. So much so that they're basically necessities for any modern music maker. Maybe you're completely inept at making electronic music, like me, or perhaps you're an amateur DJ producer who's never so much as glanced at a piece of sheet music. Whatever the case, using the tools at your disposal is essential for recreating and evolving tracks, and Matsuo is at the top of his game when it comes to doing so. Last time we talked a bit about Tendi's theme and how Diana's theme takes the basic melody and chords but recontextualizes them to sound more ethereal and mysterious. However, I also mentioned that there was one more version of her theme, and this pertains to Diana's true awakening within Tendi. To recap a bit, in the story, Keima is awakening goddesses hidden within his previously conquered heroines so that they can fight back against the ancient demon cult and also protect the girls they reside in from being assassinated. The first goddess to enter the story was Diana, who was hidden within Keima's childhood friend. What became apparent after Keima restored Vulcanus and Mars through Skio and Yui respectively was that because Diana never technically went into stasis, she lacked the power that Keima's love provided for the others.
妹たちにも翼がありますね。私だけ翼がない。一番力が戻ってない。私たちが一番最初に出たのに。天理を粗末にして。ディアナ？それが怖い。
The final version of Tendi and Diana's theme is Kami ni koista megami, the goddess who loved God. It opens with a quick run on the violins, partially mirrored by the harp before falling down chromatically from B-flat to G-flat. This is followed by a slight suspension in the music as the harp and accompanying strings reharmonize from the chromatic fall to set up the main motif in C minor, continuing to give the theme a sort of floaty, ethereal feel that we've already familiarized ourselves with when listening to Diana's theme. Personally, I find that the melody of Tendi and Diana's theme isn't particularly interesting, mostly because it sounds unintentionally derivative of Hakua's theme, and thus it's easy to confuse them with each other when trying to recall them from memory. While it may not seem like this would be much of a problem, given that 2 entire OVA episodes were basically just rearrangements and reiterations of Tendi's theme, because Hakua's theme occurred first chronologically and both girls become extremely relevant characters in Season 3, it's quite difficult to differentiate the two, especially when we move on to Hakua's thematic evolution. But continuing with Tendi's for a moment, the strongest part of Diana's true awakening theme is not the melody we've come to know and confuse with Hakua's, but the following melody taken over by the cellos as they change the key to C major in a rising, almost triumphant phrase, turning Diana's awkward and questionable confession of love for Keima into one filled with heartfelt and genuine emotion, even if the confession from the goddess herself, as opposed to Tendi, feels a little forced. Though the forced nature of the confession was always sort of the point, since she really just wants to recover her wings and be at full strength. But regardless of the forced nature, the rising C major melody paints a picture much like Mars's theme did for Yui, with the building love accompanied by more and more layers as Diana's own love seems to burst forth to empower Tendi's. I'd love to go into more detail with the analysis, but there's a big reason that I feel like it might not be worthwhile: the fact that the track never actually plays in the anime.
Huh?
Seriously, I scoured every episode in Season 3 and both OVA episodes that Tendi first appears in, and this version of Diana's theme never occurs once. That, or it started playing from a section I couldn't immediately recognize, but basically you're never going to actually hear this track unless you have the OST or you specifically seek it out. So we'll just leave it alone and move on to the next theme. I mentioned Hakwa being a much more important character in the Goddesses arc than she was before, and to be a little more specific, she essentially takes over Elsie's role for the series while Elsie is off pretending to be Kanon, since Kanon is incapacitated. Because of this, Hakwa has a lot more time to shine, and the drama and conflict surrounding her in the third season are the reason she also gets a new rendition of her theme, Kami ni koista akuma, the demon who loved God. In part 1 of this series, I talked a bit about how Hakwa has a few different renditions of her theme, given that she technically counts as a heroine even if Keima didn't have to do anything for her, but there wasn't much need to discuss the other versions in too much detail. Hakwa is probably one of the more interesting characters in Kaminomi due to the fact that she deals with a lot of her own internal conflict on top of Hell's bureaucratic instability in Season 3. These two problems compound each other as she questions her self-worth and ability to properly carry out tasks, and the new version of her theme lays it all out for us quite nicely. The piece opens with an unsettling homophonic melody played on the harp, the higher part running up and down an inversion of an open E-flat major 7th beginning with the dissonant minor 2nd from D to E-flat, while the lower part plays a C minor 9th that never really comes back to the low C until the next phrase, leaving us in a suspended space that doesn't really resolve to anything. The rhythmic phrasing is also strange in that it sounds kind of like a 3-4 or 6-8 melody, but cuts itself off part way, revealing that it's actually just in 4-4. The higher harp then shifts the E-flat major 7th B-flat down to the A, adding in a little more dissonance for even less tonal balance, while the lower harp conversely raises the G to the A to counter the additional dissonance. Once it's cycled through both of those phrases, the flute comes in with the main melody of Hakwa's theme and switches around the order of events a bit, following up the main melody with a slow rendition of the descending figure used to open up the regular version of her theme. Due to the much slower tempo, it isn't immediately obvious that this second flute melody actually is something that appeared in Hakwa's regular theme. But upon further inspection and listening, you'll notice that the new rendition simply transposes the original down a minor third and changes a few accidentals to make the phrase more harmonically stable. This is actually a really cool effect, as the original was used to somewhat mirror Elsie's theme in a more structured manner, but this version uses it to help strengthen Hakwa's resolve through the use of consonant tones that sound cohesive rather than frantic and silly. Overall, this new rendition of her theme sounds quite peaceful and calm on the surface, likely due to the instrumentation, tempo, and general simplistic rhythm patterns, and this is a nice complement to the deeper, unsettling harmonies sprinkled throughout it. But Hakwa and Tendi aren't really the important heroines worth talking about, and I most definitely saved the best two for last. I've always been a fan of all the hypothetical shippings in Kaminomi due to the fact that they were never really taken seriously, except maybe Chihiro's, but for a long time I was a really strong advocate for Shiori as the best girl. Why? I'm not entirely sure. but if I had to guess, it was likely due to the use of music every time something happened with her, or because of her themes. I'm also kind of convinced that either the director or music director, or both, considered her their favorite, the simple reason being, again, the use of her musical themes. Now, before I get into her goddess theme, let's stop for a moment to review all the conquests from Season 1 and 2 and how Keima brought them to an end. Aside from Hakwa, who didn't need to be conquered and ended up getting saved by Elsie instead of Keima anyway, every girl's kiss scene was accompanied by the main theme of the show, which made perfect sense as it was obviously written with the intention of matching those scenes and building right up to the climactic moment when it rises out of Elsie's motif into the melody of love. Except, Shiori is the one girl who didn't have the main theme playing during her conquest. Like every anime ever, this being the climax of the final arc of the season means that the opening single was played during Shiori's kiss scene. Except that you probably didn't even realize it was the opening since they used parts from the full version of the song that is,
"Oh my god, what the hell, it's 8 minutes and has multiple different sections that all sound different? What is this, Bohemian Rhapsody?"
Assuming you've already watched Season 3 of Kaminomi, and if you haven't, get on that because I'm going to spoil the ending in a bit, this particular piece of music must sound awfully familiar. Well, there are actually a couple of reasons for that, the most obvious being that it plays every time a goddess awakens, and the less obvious being that it's actually Minerva's theme, the goddess residing within Shiori, and thus is a rendition of her theme. It may seem strange that Minerva's theme is playing for all the goddesses, but given how romantic it sounds, and also its general structural development, it's highly fitting for all the awakening goddesses, and is honestly just kind of further proof that Shiori was the favorite of someone higher up. The piece begins with the familiar 3-note motif played by the violins at a very slow tempo, while the rest of the strings support the melody and provide counter melodies for texture and color. The second set of 3 notes, usually going G, B flat, F, then changes to G, B natural, F sharp, giving a brighter tone while still retaining the same dissonance and instability of the original. The supporting strings start with an F chord on the lower end, giving us a juicy G over F right from the very first note, and continue to descend to an E chord for an E minor with added ninth, and then once more to an open A minor chord for an even juicier G over A minor that's just begging to be resolved, which it does as it moves to D, setting up the triumphant resolution to our home of G, but snuffs that out by shifting up to E minor once more. It then continues shifting back and forth between major and minor keys, creating a push and pull effect to represent not just Shiori's feelings for Keima, but all the heroines as they try to come to terms with the fact that they did once love him and are only just now realizing their feelings once more without necessarily understanding why. I also can't get enough of the lengthy rising figure leading into a striking inverted A minor 7th run, transitioning into a C major descent that leaves us on an open-ended but oddly hopeful A minor 7th over C cadence to C major 7th. It should be obvious enough, but with strings being the most commonly used instruments to represent romance in pretty much every form of performance and media since the beginning of their invention, it's quite obvious why this piece, comprised only of a string ensemble, is used for all of the goddess's awakenings. But the fact that Matsuo was able to evolve Shiori's theme into something so versatile with the basic 3-note motif actually blows my mind. There are 2 more new renditions of Shiori's theme that get used for the 3rd season as well, the first being a silly minimalist version comprised of a few woodwind and percussion instruments to accompany the goofy stories Shiori has created in an attempt to write her own novel. The second is a much more emotional piano and violin duet to accompany the story she writes that is merely an account of her own feelings and self at the current time. While it doesn't sound like anything particularly special on its own, it manages to express Shiori's feelings of nervousness, gratitude, and love all in a short 2-minute rendition that just makes you want to pull her into a big warm hug. Oh yeah, and that makes one heroine with 5 thematic renditions. And did I mention that her goddess awakening scene is accompanied by 4 different love themes? That's right, 4. The main theme that she never got during her original conquest, the piano and violin duet I just mentioned, a brand new original love theme reserved just for this scene when Keima pulls her into an embrace and kisses her on the cheek in what has to be the most adorable kiss scene in the entire series. And of course, Minerva's theme at the end of it all. If that isn't enough proof that Shiori was at least one person's best girl, I don't know how else to convince you. And now I'm going to spoil the ending of the Goddesses arc, so this really is the last chance to leave and watch the show if you haven't already. To find the last goddess, Mercurius, Keima has narrowed it down to Ayumi and Chihiro, but both have given him reason to believe that they could be the one. This allows for further development of both of their themes, as it's unclear which girl Mercurius is hiding in until Chihiro reveals that she doesn't have any memory of her conquest at the worst possible moment. Suddenly, the new rendition on Chihiro's gloomy theme feels somehow more lighthearted and more gloomy at the same time, as we now turn to Ayumi, who had all but given up on Keima to allow her best friend to date him despite both of them having feelings for him. And so when Keima tosses Chihiro aside, Ayumi's frustrations at having trusted him while also feeling upset at blowing her own chances at love come creeping into the forefront of a dark new take on her cheerful theme from season 1. Rather than a nice driving rhythm pushed forward by the offbeats, we instead get this ominous 4-note diatonic arpeggio in E minor, followed by a whole step down to D minor, back up again to E minor, down to an inverted D minor 7th triad, and finally a diatonic B minor before we hit the block chords leading into the main melody. The original springy strides in the supporting rhythms and light staccato notes in the main melody have morphed into heavy, dark chords that no longer resolve the way we want them to, indicative of the sadness and anger felt by all three characters involved in the painful love triangle they find themselves in. This is further compounded by a cadence near the end where we hope the back and forth A minor 7th to D major 7th will resolve to a G major, but instead loops back into the diatonic E minor arpeggio from the beginning of the piece that ends with two simple but heart-rendingly unresolved notes in the melody and harmony, F sharp and E respectively. This of course can't go unfinished however, as Keima still needs to awaken the goddess within Ayumi, and so we get the most developed goddess piece of the 6, with parts of her original theme peppered throughout an incredibly emotional string-heavy orchestral piece. The piece opens with the flute making an octave leap up from its lowest pitch of middle C to the higher C, a melodic technique often used for grand heroic gestures or catchy song hooks. Instead, this octave leap is quite subdued, pulled along by a steady rhythm somewhat reminiscent of the offbeat rhythm that drove along the original theme. As the flute finishes its melody, the harp plucks away a steady rhythm to suspend the opening for a moment longer before the violins come sailing in on a run-up from G to E, supported by block chords from the lower strings. And while the melody isn't the same as what we expect Ayumi's to sound like, the similar contour of the melody from the run-up to its emotional descent triggers an association regardless of how different it actually sounds from the original. The violin section leads into a light and airy flute melody much higher than the opening section, focusing on Ayumi's youthful feelings for Keima while the violins play counter melodies mostly comprised of small quotations of her original theme, as if to ground her to the reality that Keima's motives aren't based on any sort of feelings for her, but some sort of manipulative scheme she hasn't been made privy to. Following a false climax, the violins then repeat a similar melody and counter-melody to what we just heard on the flute and cello, leading into another false climax that leads into a new section that makes all kinds of references to her original theme without ever really playing it the same way as it was in the original. While this is all going on, a group of trombones comes blasting in to provide some counter melodies from the underutilized brass section and assists the ensemble into the real climax as an explosion of sound comes firing out from the strings, woodwinds, trombones, percussion, and harp. At last, the final goddess has been awoken and the music begins to peacefully fade away as Keima's final conquest of the goddess's arc comes to a close with the first heroine he ever had to rescue. And with that, we've finally come to a close on the Kami no Mi review and analysis. I really didn't mean for this to be so long, but once I started rewatching the show and re-listening to the soundtrack to prep for this video, I realized just how much I love the show in pretty much every aspect. I mean, for what could have ended up being another dumb harem show, Kami no Mi managed to capture the essence of a harem while actually exploring the characters in a way that believably allowed for no real romantic development, while also managing to develop the romance over a short span of time. And with the goddess's arc, this got explored way more in depth than it ever really should have for such a dumb concept, and it even ends with Takema seeming to feel remorseful for all the manipulative actions he's taken towards the girls up until this point, providing some much needed character development for the reclusive gamer that makes him feel human for the first time. Unfortunately, it doesn't end with much explanation as to what happens after the goddess's arc, so the only way to find out is to read the manga, and of course the manga doesn't seem to have any official translation anywhere that I could find, so go about that however you feel like. But just keep in mind that you won't be getting any more killer music out of it. I'm sure this isn't the last time I'm going to be bringing up The World God Only Knows in a video, because the music is such a standout example of how to write good character themes, and also a great way to show how to develop them too. And I didn't even get a chance to cover all the characters in the show because that would have just taken way too much time, and God only knows how much I wanted to talk about the new love theme that plays during Minerva's awakening. Anyway, before I get too sidetracked and start seriously contemplating the part 4 for this series that's gone on way too long, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. And if you want to see more content like this, be sure to become a patron over on my Patreon so that I can keep making these videos better and more frequently. And to those of you who have already done so over the past month or so since this channel's been launched, thank you so much for all your support. And once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.